All right, so now we're moving into chapter 11 of Griffin's book on human rights. If you recall, the first 10 chapters covered parts 1 and 2. And part 1 was the presentation, the overall view that he has of what human rights are, and he tries to ground them in this notion of a normative nature, a normative agent. And then in part 2, so part 1 lays out kind of the theoretical framework in one sense, and then part 2 talks about the high level kinds of values and corresponding rights, namely autonomy and of course liberty and welfare. So with parts 1 and 2, we have a pretty good idea of Griffin's framework. So part 3 that we're in now, starting with chapter 11. So part 3 starts with chapter 11. On human rights, we're now looking at discrepancies between international law, sometimes I'll say just IL, and philosophy. So now we're looking at taking Griffin, or we're going to follow Griffin as he takes his ideas and his general framework. It's kind of a theory, but remember, we're not doing math, so it's not as rigorous as a mathematical theory or a physical theory, but it's got an analogous kind of level of objectivity. We've seen him press that case that value judgments are not just simply whims. Remember all that stuff on value judgments not being accounted for by the taste model. It's more of a combination taste perception, and you can get value judgments that do indeed have some objectivity to them. Not perfect objectivity, but again, Griffin wants to make the argument nothing has that. So let's look now at human rights as sort of this difference amongst lists. Now, we've seen Griffin talk about this way back in the early days of the videos. That is when Griffin was talking about human rights and their origin out of natural rights. And, you know, when he went back a little bit to the medieval ages, but especially concentrated on, like the Renaissance, and then things connected with the French and the American revolutions. And, of course, the Enlightenment list of rights. Now, we've seen Griffin talk about lists of rights in various ways and how he's trying to more or less carve a middle route out amongst, the really short lists that are normally associated with the Enlightenment and kind of the Rawlsian perspective. So remember, Rawls had his list of human rights, when he was talking about well-ordered peoples. And then on the other hand, though, so you have this really limited view, and then way on the other side is this kind of modern view that, where the list of rights is huge. And Griffin is trying to say, well, we can have a non-arbitrary way to situate ourselves on that spectrum of the very limited to the overabundant through this model that he has constructed, namely that human rights are, once again, they're simply means to protect our normative agency, and our normative agency is the ability to conceptualize a well conceived life and evaluate it and pursue it. All right, so we're back in list territory, and so he's talked a little bit about human rights from the perspective of international law and human rights from the perspective of philosophy. He's done a philosophical analysis, but back we go to the lists that come out of international agreements, and specifically to begin with the treaties, right? Now, there's way more than I put up here. So there's more that Griffin refers to. So I'm not doing all the ones he refers to. And he doesn't refer to all of the ones that exist. There's loads of these international agreements. But this is just hitting the high point to give us an idea better of what Griffin's after when he's talking about these discrepancies between these international law lists or treaties lists and what comes out of philosophy. So 1948, you have the UDHR, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, sorry, and it's hortatory. I mean, it exhorts, it encourages. It's like these things are human rights, and you should recognize these things. It doesn't really have any binding power, but so it's hortatory, sort of exhorts. It's like you should recognize them, and you've got that big list, and we've seen him kind of go after some of those things before. But he's going to return. We'll talk a little bit more. He gives a little bit more of a sympathetic reading of what's going on in the 1948 document. But hold on, we'll get to that in a minute. So there's that. And then nearly 20 years later, you have a UN declaration with a number of international covenants that are come around 1966, and they're signed and ratified in due process a little bit later. But they come along, their covenants of economic, social, and cultural rights, so all about rights, and civil and political rights. And this is more of a legal kind of binding framework. Now he says that there's a paucity of theory, right? And it's true. If you read those documents, they're really saying there are a bunch of you shoulds, or it is the case that's. It's a lot of that, right? You know, it's sort of laying out the lists of what should be done or what, but it doesn't dig into why. In other words, they just say, well, these rights, you know, they might not be self-evident, but they derive from something fundamental, which they call the inherent dignity of the person. Okay, well, they tell a little bit of a story. So all these you shoulds and your obligations and all these rights and things, these documents say flow or derive from, they don't say how, they just say come from the inherent dignity of the individual or the person, sorry. Now, this brings about an important point. In law, law's not, now again, these are generalities, but in general, when you read laws, they're not really digging into justification. Laws they're not self-justifying, not usually. They may have rationales here and there, but usually laws are quite abstract. I mean, this is why we have judges, because they have to often interpret these things, but they're usually consisting of high-level and abstract agreements, right? So, well, we'll put that in because we kind of agree on it all. But think about it. I'm qualifying the notion of agreement by saying it's a high-level or abstract one. Now, you know, you can get agreement on anything amongst anybody if you go to a high enough level of abstraction, right? You know, as they say, the devil's in the details, right? Down in the weeds, that's usually where the disagreements are. Most people can agree on most things as long as you phrase it really abstractly. You know, like, you know, most people, even people who are in favor of capital punishment, would agree that murder is wrong and all that stuff. But if you can phrase these things in an abstract enough way, you can get everybody on all sides to agree on most things. I'm not saying that's what laws is doing, but nonetheless, the higher the point is that the higher and more abstract the level of conversation, the more likely you're going to get agreement, which is why you often hear politicians, they talk about, well, we worked out the general frameworks of an agreement. We got an agreement, and then we'll send our diplomats in and maybe our lawyers to get a more fine-grained, you know, crossing T's and dotting I's, that cliche. But even that only goes so far. In other words, this is what we've seen before. This is more of that formal approach. And Griffin talked about that. And if the formal approach doesn't ring a bell, you'll have to go back to some previous videos. In other words, the formal approach won't really unpack what the term inherent dignity of the person means. It will leave it more or less open to interpretation. So if I'm one state and you're another state, we can both say, oh yeah, there's inherent dignity of the person and these rights flow from that. And that's where our conversation will stop. We won't really dig into what we mean by inherent dignity. We won't even dig into person, right? Because, you know, like if you really started digging into the person, then you'd be having to answer questions like, is a fetus a person? You know, like, what do you mean by person? That's not going to happen at this level of discussion. It's too high level, right? Not interpreting it on that level. We'll see more of that a little bit later when we talk about privacy. In any case, so it's a formal approach. It's not going to unpack the inherent dignity, leaves it open to interpretation, and it's sort of like getting an agreement. Yeah, we got the agreement. Let's run with it. And there's a pragmatic element to it, and so there is a moral justification clearly for operating at the high level rather than always going immediately into the weeds. So you can get more stuff done. So goes the pragmatic argument when you're willing to work at a more formal level. But philosophy is what's underneath. When you really get into these problems of interpretation, now you're moving away and you're starting to do philosophy, because now it's a substantive approach. That's where people start saying things like, well, inherent dignity of the person, that sounds great, but I don't know what it means. So what exactly does that mean? What grounds this dignity? What do you mean by dignity? Where does it come from? What does person mean? In other words, you're starting to ask questions like very specifically about what is the intention of this concept, inherent dignity of the person. And then, of course, you get into the problems. Well, okay, what's the intention? What's the extension? How can we make the arguments for the intention determining the extension, et cetera, et cetera? So in that sense, we've got a much deeper sort of territory to dig into when we start looking at it from a philosophical perspective. So overall, you have, international law and philosophy. You've got more of the high level international law, and philosophy is what's underneath it. Griffin's point really is that, there's tension between the two, because sometimes these conversations can wreck these, right? You think you have an agreement, and then a philosopher comes along and ruins it. That's possible. But then did you really have an agreement? Well, not really. It's not as deep as you thought, but maybe you had an agreement that was good enough for your purposes, and a philosopher ruins it. So it's not that these are clear cut, which one's better. And he's not saying that. And maybe you don't always want to go to this, because, always going to this level, you can end up arguing when you're trying to get some sort of treaty or deal going. And then, we couldn't agree on what a person was, and you couldn't get anything going. So sometimes philosophical arguments would cause, like if diplomats all argued like philosophers, you'd say they wouldn't get much done, because they'd be doing philosophy. In any case, but that doesn't mean it's not necessary. It just means it has its place. So in other words, there's tension, but we will need them both in our investigation of human rights. So we've got to try and think these two together and be sympathetic to each. And sometimes lawyers are sympathetic. Some of them will be more sympathetic to the idea that, we have to worry about the philosophical underpinnings. Some lawyers are not sympathetic at all. We're going to see that this actually touches on some pretty deep issues that go right into the heart of conceptualizing international relations as well. All right, so now that we've gone through parts 1 and 2, let's look a little bit at this, again, continuing on. So we've seen that Griffin thinks that there are two grounds of human rights, like the personhood and practicalities, right? So abstract rights they flow out of personhood, and the practicalities will give these abstract rights some shape. And so from this well-developed account of personhood, we can get all our human rights, and then we can give them more shape in terms of the practicalities. Okay, so what I want to look at in the next video is just to start fleshing this out a little bit more, and then starting looking at these lists. And what are we going to make of this? What are we going to make of this tension? And how do we put all this together into a better, more coherent account of human rights? Stay tuned.